Welcome to the deep dive of Key to My Research, the science podcast by the Excellence Strategy at the University of Tübingen. I'm Jennifer, your host, and in this episode, we will meet Professor Dr. Dorothee Kimmich. She's a professor for cultural studies and cultural theory in the German department of the University of Tübingen. Welcome, Professor Dr. Kimmich, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So before we delve into the depths of cultural theory and the paradigms and concepts and ideas you've developed and are currently developing, tell us a bit about your story and your academic career path up to today.
The story is quite boring, I would say, because it starts in Tübingen and more or less it ends in Tübingen.
Which makes it even more interesting.
It's a kind of full circle, yes.
Yeah.
So I studied in Tübingen I can't believe that, in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And then went to Paris for a whole year, I think. And this was kind of a turning point in my study career, but also in the style, I would say, in the style of thinking. Because I met in the 80s, there were Foucault still in Paris and giving lectures, and you could attend all kind of super lectures with Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault.
So did you actually meet Foucault? I just have to ask.
I did. And it was extremely interesting because today you couldn't imagine, because you just walked into Collège de France and he created kind of an atmosphere that was really special, and it was very dense, and everyone was staring and listening in a very, very wonderful atmosphere. And afterwards, everyone was discussing what we were listening to. So this was really interesting, and also the Derrida lectures, very different, very intellectual, super complicated, but it was kind of a very vivid time, and we had to discuss a lot of things. And I came from Tübingen, and the first 2 weeks I had to change my clothes and change the whole habit. I started smoking because this was very important.
So you stopped again?
Yeah, sure.
After Foucault, okay, good.
So you had to change the habit and also kind of a habit of thinking. And when I came back to Tübingen, it was quite difficult to readapt to not only a small town, but also different kind of discussions and thinking. And afterwards, I went to Freiburg because I didn't get a job. I'm from the baby boomer generation, so it was quite difficult to get a job as a teacher at school, and there were no jobs. And someone told me if there is no job for you, you might write a dissertation just to fill the gap.
Mm-hmm. So you got into your research in science by filling the gap.
Yeah, and that was it. So I stayed at university, went to Gießen and to Frankfurt, and came back to Tübingen.
So what does your current research focus on? Like coming from Foucault and Derrida, where would you place your research now?
Between literature and philosophy. And that's exactly the space where I settled down after Paris. Because I learned that there is the in-between history, philosophy, or what we call philosophy today here, in between history, philosophy, and all kind of arts. And for me, it's more literature. This is the vibrant space of thinking and teaching, and also teaching.
Mm-hmm. And what makes this space so vibrant? I mean, I have an idea, I have a sense of it, but could you just explain it a bit, please?
I think it's the only a zone, you might call it, where you can recognize or even feel how deep art and literature is, how deep it is part of our everyday life and our narrations, our discourses, our habits, and our behavior. And because it's part of our history, our biography, and the kind of thinking we develop. And this is, how do you want to live? Normally, you don't think that you need art to do that, and you don't think that you need philosophy. But if you combine it with history and philosophy and art, this is the ambit you are living in.
It's interesting you're telling us about all this, because actually an archaeologist with whom we were talking said art is necessary for survival.
Yep.
So would you sign that? Or
sure.
How would you see that as a cultural theorist?
Absolutely. I even know who said that. It is Nicholas Conrad, and we had this here in Tübingen. It's so close. We know each other, and it's so interesting to meet people you would never meet in large or it's more difficult to meet in large universities. And here in Tübingen, you have the occasion really to talk to people you don't meet in your everyday teaching or research. And I think this is extremely interesting to talk to the archaeologists, because they give us an idea what we would formulate in a little bit differently maybe, but I would say if you have no imagination, you can't survive. And it's the imaginary you live from and you live for. And the imaginary is nourished by also memory and what you remember. And it's even in the brain, it's quite near. The neurophysiologists tell us that is a kind of a capacity which combines the capacity to remember and memory. And you need to have imagination, to have plans, to make plans, to decide, because you have to have an idea that you can decide between 2 or 3 or even 10 solutions. And if you have an imagination, you can't solve any problem. And even, I don't think, be happy, because you feel forced or obliged to follow a certain way. And if you have an imagination, you have a choice. And if you have a choice and you really are able to realize that you have a choice, you are much happier than feeling forced.
Mm. Okay, so from the sphere of the imagination, I'd like to get down to the sphere of material things. Mm-hmm. And things is a topic you've done lots of research about. Could you tell us a bit about this field?
Mm-hmm. This is one of my favorite fields.
Very good.
And this was also quite random, that I realized the more I worked on modern literature, that I was really surprised to see how often things, objects, do play an important role in modern literature. And normally you would say modern literature is for the invention of the individual and for the forging in a certain way the modern human being in the Western world. So we are mostly talking about very restricted Western literature. And that's what I know about. I'm really not. I'm a comparatist, but I don't really know nothing about Chinese literature, Japanese literature, even Latin American literature. So it's very restricted kind of perspective on the Western world, and this is something we have to change in the next decades. Yes, but back to the modern literature. Normally, you would expect that it's about how human beings live in big cities, in modern cities, in a modern society, and what kind of problems they are facing with family or single life or industrial life in big cities. Mm-hmm. But
so sorry, just to interrupt. So that's one of the subject matters of modern literature.
Yeah. And that's what normally you would expect, but surprisingly, things play an enormous role in modern literature. And if you concentrate on the question why things play such an important role, you realize that all these objects have a certain kind of intriguing life. And at the first glance, you would say that has no room in modern literature, because we know that things are material and material is dead. So this is the definition. And if you are a person who believes in living material, maybe you are esoteric or a little bit crazy even, and or a child. Children do believe in living puppets, or
that's where imagination comes up again. But what do you mean with things having a life?
Yeah.
Why in literature? Could you just explain it a bit more, please?
Mm-hmm. So you have lots of novels or short stories where adults and not children are confronted with objects that talk, that run around and they want to live with you. Or there's a very nice short story about an Austrian author, and he tells, every time I come home, I knock a little bit on my door to tell the objects and the things in the room that they can go back to their places where I put them when I left my home, so that I'm not too scared and everything is in order. But I do know that when I'm absent, all these kind of objects have fun and they play around, and so he's telling about how he's convinced that objects have a certain kind of life, and many things in these different novels and short stories have this kind of, not absolutely obvious, but you have a feeling that they move, that they look at you, that they have a face, or that they share the life with you.
Mm-hmm. Or might even change your behavior.
Yeah, sure. So you have to adapt. You have to be friendly to things because they feel pain and they might have a soul or something like that. So this is really interesting. And it's interesting because if you continue reading these texts or commenting on that kind of text, you get a different attitude, a different habitus in confronting things, because you are told by these texts that you shouldn't use them only. Mm-hmm. It's not, and you shouldn't exploit them because they are partners of your life. So this is kind of telling you that the nature, animals, and also material things are partners in life, and not only things you can use for your own needs and afterwards you can throw them away, or you could destroy them or not use them, or even forget them. Don't forget the old things, because they will be sad or even angry about that.
And would you say, do they still play such a big role in current literature, or is this really something of the modernist epoch?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. In postmodern literature, you have comparable texts, but let's say the focus changes a little bit, because people feel more and more invaded by objects, and things really in the objects become more and more dangerous also. They are many and they have become dangerous, and it's more difficult to be a friend of the objects you live with. And in modern literature, this is kind of, I think, to make it a little bit more theoretical, more interesting, maybe it is also it's contesting the divide between nature and culture, and between the material and the non-material, or the spirit and the material, or the living and the dead. So you would say human beings and even animals are living beings, whereas all these kind of things are dead material. And the divide between the dead and the living and the material and the spirit and nature and culture, these big divides, what we invented more or less in the 19th or even starting in the 18th century, is now contested, and not only contested by philosophy, that comes much later, only at the end of the 20th century, but it's contested by literature, that you should rethink these kind of categories and also these kind of ordering the world.
You had one example about Charlie Chaplin in one of our prior talks. Yeah. Could you elaborate on this topic?
Mm-hmm. So Charlie Chaplin is, for us today, I don't know, for those people who really know films, he is still a star. But in the 20s and 30s, not only people who loved the films, just watching his films, but all international intellectuals and people from academia loved Charlie Chaplin. And why? He had a certain international humor, and he was fantastic for many people, but he shaped a personality that could, as an adult, talk and live with children and talk to objects and things, and he lived in a totally different universe in a certain way. and he lived together with many objects. And maybe you remember when he tries to repair a watch, and then all the little bits and things. This is one of the moments where you can see that things could start living, and then they start dancing, and he tries to communicate with these kind of bits and pieces, and at the end he can't realize, and he finds any kind of, he's very sly to to stop working. And Modern Times is one of the most beautiful films I could imagine, and there you have this person who is forced to work in a terrible kind of torture, so work becomes torture, and then he realizes that he could, together with the machines, they have this wonderful choreography where at the end the whole thing is in kind of a super party destroyed. So, and this is also kind of rebellion, or if you want. And together with the machines help the human beings to re-become human.
Just the topic of machines, with them actually having no kind of personality, become these personalities.
Mm-hmm. And he becomes part of the machine, but it's not anti-humanistic, because as he becomes part of the machine becomes part of him. And also this kind of divide between the human and the machine is also contested in, you can do it in a very critical way and say people become machines, and this is to be criticized. But with Charlie Chaplin, he makes machines all friends.
I think I've got a very good sense about the sphere of your academic research concerning this topic. But if you had to put it in a nutshell, if it's possible, could you give it a shot at just explaining to our listeners, what are you aiming at to find out with this research about things?
How to live with things.
That was in a nutshell. Okay.
You could also say, which kind of community do I imagine?
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm talking about conviviality, do I think about only human beings, or also maybe animals, plants, things? And how do and are things part of the little cosmos I'm living in? And do I use them only, or do I accept that there is something I have to take care for?
Mm-hmm. And if you think of like the place you live at, your house, your flat, how do you live with things?
This is interesting. I love my walking shoes, because for years and years and years, they were my kind of partners when I would go for a long walk, and even when it's raining or I'm tired or things like that. So you are all the time staring and looking at your shoes when you climb a mountain or something. And when they were broken, I had normally I should throw them away, and I couldn't do this. So I decided to bury them in a very beautiful place in Tessin. I put them. And I kind of, because the feeling that they are just only material, but they were in a certain way, they were part of they became part of my body, of my history, of my memory. And it was not a good idea to bury them, and you could do it in a different way. But the idea that this is just an object that has nothing to do with me, and it's not me, it's not my body. I had the feeling that this is a wrong concept. Mm-hmm. And if you start thinking like that, you can throw away things, you can use it in a very terrible way, what we do with nature. And it's not only about objects or things you are working with every day, but what this kind of habit is how we use nature and do still.
Mm-hmm. Like all you've just been saying about your trainers that you buried, it makes me think of a pop star of modern times, of pop culture, of clearing up Marie Kondo. So actually, when she clears up houses, you might have heard of her. She's a queen of minimalism. Mm-hmm. And whenever she goes to a house, she'll greet the house and she'll help people clear up their things and live a more like a better life through minimalism. So there's basically a parallel there between giving things a special kind of worth, greeting them, and seeing them not only as objects but things that have a personal, which you have a personal relationship with. And she always says, just keep everything that sparks joy.
Yeah, that's right. It's not an esoteric idea that you start talking to your toothbrush or things like that. So it is about the reflection on what is my ambit, or what is the little cosmos I'm living in, and how do I create an atmosphere which helps me to feel comfortable.
And what would you say, where is this research about this specific topic heading at the moment? So what questions do you still want to answer, or are you content at the moment?
No, but I think this is the first steps to go to what we call now environmental humanities, which goes in a quite different direction to talk about nature and animals and even plants and the relation to human beings. And the relation to things, material or object, is, I would say, part of this new kind of environmental humanities. And this will be a very, very important part of research we have, not me, but many of my colleagues, and maybe for a very small part, I myself will do in the next decades.
Mm-hmm. And could you give us an idea of how you will be working with your colleagues? Like, how do you do research?
Oh, this is a good question, and I've had the experience. It's quite different from what people do in biology or in medicine or even in archaeology. The people in the humanities, my colleagues and I, we mostly work alone at home. And it's even the anthropologists don't do that. But the colleagues from the history department, they go to archives and looking for sources, and they have also to travel. We have to exchange ideas and perspectives, theories and methods, and to discuss the approaches. And we can also give hints, but at the end, the reading and writing is something what you have still maybe will change by ChatGPT and other tools. But until this moment, we do it very alone.
Very manually, but you are surrounded by things that might be alive.
Yeah, many people were. There were beautiful pictures of Sigmund Freud's working desk, for example, bureau, and he had lots of inspiring little things.
Okay, we know you're doing lots of research and reading and spending lots of time also by yourself, not only in close contact with other colleagues, but how do you develop a specific research question?
This is perhaps not so difficult from other types of research. Normally you feel uncomfortable or unhappy with the answers you get from books or from your colleagues. And you have the idea that this kind of categorization or this kind of answer might be not enough or not subtle enough or is too black and white, and you have to rework or to answer it in a different way. And that's, for example, this kind of that you feel uncomfortable with a certain divide between the human and the material. And you have the idea, what does it mean material? And what does it mean human? You are also kind of material. And what is literature telling about that? And does literature also feel uncomfortable? And can you resonate with literature where you can realize that literature tells you something about these questions that have to be answered.
And talking about a paradigm that you developed, the similarity as a paradigm of cultural theory, how did you develop this certain research topic or question?
This is exactly a good example for developing the research question, because I felt quite uncomfortable with the idea of divide another division in identity and otherness or alterity. So the idea, and this is maybe a little bit theoretical, but if you have the idea that you are a person because you are not another person. And you might remember that you learned in linguistics or structuralism that a thing is a word or a term has a meaning, not because it's designing a thing or something you can touch, because it does not mean anything else. So a cat is a cat because it's not designing a dog. Mm-hmm. And this kind of thinking in difference is what was developed in the 20th century and had a huge success in many, many different fields. So also in cultural theory, in cultural studies, in linguistics, for instance, but also in anthropology, and afterwards in many different kind of, even in philosophy, that's what you call structuralism, and afterwards different variations of post-structuralism. So this kind of thinking in differences creates quite a lot of philosophical problems, and the biggest problem is that you don't know what a difference might be. Has a difference, an ontological status. So everyone knows because we can play with the word difference, but what kind of status has difference? Is different the nothing between something, and what kind of status is this? And this is the big issue of Jacques Derrida and his deconstruction, to ask and say, yeah, everyone is talking about difference, but do you really know what it is, what it means? Is difference God? Or he makes kind of jokes about that. And he says, you don't know what you talk about God, you don't know God, and you talk about difference, and you don't know what difference is. Nobody can really explain that. To go back to my question, is that the idea that an identity is more or less the result of all the differences to other people, so that identity needs the othering of other people. So I'm what I am because I'm not my brother. I'm what I am because I'm not my husband, or I'm a woman because I'm not a man. And this is one of the most difficult results we had, that in feminism, the feminist movement realized that to have a female identity, which is defined by the fact that they are not men, this is what Simone de Beauvoir says, it's not possible to define myself as a not man.
Mm-hmm. This all sounds as if it might be a kind of sort of negative way of defining yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the case. So, but you are also defining the other person in a negative way, because you say you are you because you are not me. And this is in a very simple way. It's a little bit more complicated, but in a certain way, we are used to think like that. We do think in these categories. But everyone says, you can't compare apples and pears. And it's not right. You can very well compare apples and pears. It's very easy. Even if you touch them, sometimes you can't even make a difference. Even the form, sometimes color is very, very similar. So this is quite only a stupid saying. But people say, yes, sure, you can't compare. It's different. Why it is different? Because we have we say this is an apple, this pears, but the most important thing is that you have to realize that you have to compare, and that there is similarity and there is overlapping, and there is not a red line between pears and apples. Maybe for a biologist who has really to determine categories for his research, but in everyday life, no problem. And you do it you have to do things like that. Sorry.
And where do you think this negative bias comes from? Where does it originate from?
There are attempts to explain, and one attempt is the easiest way. The philosophers who try to explain, they name it the economy of everyday life. Mm-hmm. So, and this is a whole bunch of behavior, what you have in this kind of economy of everyday life, so that you don't see many things, what you don't need. And so if you close your eyes and I would ask you what kind of color does the door have, or door handle or something, you wouldn't know. The door, you have touched the door handle, I don't know, 50 times here in the Brechtbau, but you wouldn't remember. This is kind of the economy, because if you remember all these kind of things, you wouldn't be able to remember what you want to.
Because you have to set your focus on certain things to be able to structure your world and to sort of live.
Yeah. And this is a thesis that it is easier to have these harsh categories and say, this is, I want to buy apples, so I buy this one. I'm not sure if this is right, and many psychologists would not agree, because many neurophysiologists would also, I think, not agree, because they would say that the human brain performs by comparing all the time. But I can't just refer what others say. I can't explain it.
And why are these concepts of identity and otherness, why are they becoming ever more questionable? So why should we question them?
Oh, because you can see at the moment the very difficult results of what we created with these kind of concepts. I wouldn't say that identity is not a very important concept. It is. We need to have the idea of identity. But the problem is identity cannot be defined by the difference to another, because in this way you depend on the others, and identity is not something stable, but it's extremely fuzzy and fluent, and it has to be conceptualized as fuzzy and fluid and adaptable in different situations. And if you don't do that, you have this kind of very strict idea of boundaries of an identity and also the other. And if you start thinking in this kind of boundary and limits and in differentiation, you become ideological, unflexible, and you can't adjust to situations and you can't adjust to other people.
And it doesn't sound very healthy, just defining yourself by someone else.
Yeah, and communication becomes difficult. And there's huge discussion, how can you communicate with people if you are other than you?
And what you say is the common ground which we would have with everyone. Okay, we're all human beings, but why are we all so similar in contrast to being so different?
We are, that's the case. Aristotle said, and also modern philosophers said, people are afraid of similarity, because similarity is very slippery. You are more or less similarity. You can also say, everything is similar to everything in a certain way. I would say this is wrong, but you have to say that everything is similar to something, and everyone is similar to some other people, more or less. And it's similarity is a category of the more or less, and that's what you have to. In a certain way, you have to learn to accept. Sometimes people have an uncomfortable or misfeeling if you tell them, remember when people say, you are so similar to your mother, you resemble your mother so much. And some might like it and others say, oh my God, no, I want to be my own personality.
It's like in following someone's footsteps, like being like, part of your family, looking like them, having the same career path. But basically, one wants to be different.
If you talk about yourself, you wouldn't say, I resemble very much my mother. It's my mother. And this is not the first thing you would tell someone, or to tell about something about yourself. You would not say, I'm very, very close to my brother. So we have the idea that we are a unit and that we are a single person, an individual. And this is the most important thing, what we think that we have to develop during our lifetime, to be individual. But what is ridiculous, because we all buy the same clothes, eat the same food. And
maybe one last question regarding this topic. Do you feel that this paradigm change is taking place? I mean, you are one that's initiating it, or is like taking the first steps. Do you feel there's been a shift?
Yes, a little bit. So in the first 5 years, I was working on it, and I have to say it's not something I developed myself or alone. I did it, for instance, with colleagues from India. And this is also quite important because I think the input from Indian philosophy and also from African theorists is extremely important, because the ideas of a very isolated modern individuality is more contested from an Indian or an African philosophical background than we know it here in Europe. And it was extremely helpful to develop the idea of similarity within other traditions, thought traditions. And that's why I can say when I first traveled and attended conferences with my colleague Anil Bhatti, it was always, the discussions weren't friendly. So we were told that this is slippery and fuzzy, and we couldn't have good, and the definitions are ridiculous and things like that. So people were interested but not convinced. I can realize that more and more people are interested in these kind of fuzzy categories, and people realize that this could be. It is not yet a paradigm shift. It could be a paradigm shift, but you have to say we can't lose difference, because similarity lives from difference. It's not, similarity is many, many different, more or less different. I think that this is, in a certain way, we realize that people are listening in a different way, asking a different way, and are open to talk about and think about these kind of new concepts. And I think it's also due to the idea of environmental humanities and these kind of all new concepts of conviviality, of living together, even the proximity to objects and people. And then you realize that you don't have only difference, but that you have that you live in communities and you have similarity. You have to realize, to detect and to address similarity with what surrounds you, because otherwise you can't have a relation to something which is completely different or completely other. And this leads to isolation. No one lives isolated.
Whereas openness would then be a key to this paradigm shift.
Yeah. Openness is all to every paradigm shift. Openness in a certain way, it's just another word for paradigm shift, because if you are not open, you can't paradigm shift. But I think that people do feel the need for different concepts, for different narratives, and afterwards also for different behavior, because this has to come together. Otherwise, no need, just concepts. It's not interesting. It has to lead to another. We're talking about narratives or discourses or so. And the discourse is not I'm myself because I'm not you, but I'm myself because I'm not the same, but in a certain way similar to many people, more or less. The people I'm living with, and they are shaping me and I'm shaping them.
Okay, this is quite a hard cut, but I'd like to get back to the University of Tübingen. I was just thinking how I can have a smooth transformation from that topic to this. And I'd like to know, what does it mean to you to do research and work in Tübingen?
Oh, for me, I have to say, that's fantastic. At the moment, we have really a vibrant research atmosphere. So maybe first, Tübingen is an interesting university because we have many, 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 many disciplines. Many other universities don't have anymore. We have specialists for Chinese culture and history, for Japanese history. We have these wonderful anthropologist departments. We have a big history department, and we have many, many other languages and cultures and many different kinds of historical departments or historical research, not only all parts of the world, but all times of the world. And this is extremely interesting. And so we are very close to each other because Tübingen is so small. You have to know those people. And you have many opportunities to work together. And there is something also really what is quite also, I think, an exception that even with departments like the natural sciences or also medicine, the people in the medical department here are also interested in our research, and we can a little wonder, we can talk to each other from people from the psychiatry department of psychosomatic department, and people there are really cooperation is possible. And this is a big chance here in Tübingen. And I would say at the moment, the spirit of cooperation is very, you can feel that. I can't explain why this is at the moment the case, but you have just to profit. This is the...
Yeah, it sounds like an ideal spot for doing your research. What about Tübingen as a place for living?
I'm an elder person, so I don't miss anymore the clubs. This is very different, and it's also interesting. People who are coming from New Delhi, for example, students from New Delhi, they love Tübingen because they say you can live here, you can go out by night, there's no danger, you are safe. Even, for instance, women coming from different places all over the world, they really do love Tübingen also. And this sounds a little bit weird because you would say, no clubs, no party, no nothing. And the whole thing is kind of a museum. But you have, even in this case, sometimes you have changed the perspective. And there are so many cities in the world, even Johannesburg or something. So people appreciate this kind of puppet house here. Tübingen is quite nice, even for families. It's nice because you have all this forest around Tübingen, and Stuttgart is not so far. And you have, even if this is a puppet house, you have an airport and a big city where you can go to theaters and opera houses and everything.
So if you don't go to clubs anymore, what do you do in your free time?
Oh, in my free time, in summer, I'm cycling because this is also a good part of Tübingen. You don't have to cycle through, kilometers of houses and big streets. You take your bike and you start in a few kilometers. You are in the Schwäbische Alb or in the Black Forest, and this is one of meeting friends. And Tübingen is, when I say it's a puppet house, we have wonderful theaters and we have also cinemas, and you have all these kind of interesting talks what you can attend, because every evening you have so many things you can. You have the choice is difficult. So it's not a sleeping place here. It's very small, but it's not sleepy.
What is the key to your research?
It's a difficult question, but I try. So I would say reading, to learn reading, and not only texts, but also faces and gestures and sounds. And reading in this case means making sense, but also realizing when things don't make sense for you, and being sensible for different forms of sense and not only imposing sense, and maybe sensible reading of text and the world.
Okay, Professor Dr. Kimmich, I thank you very much for this very interesting talk, the deep dive into your research and sharing your story, your career path, and also the private side of your life. Thanks for having you, and thanks for joining this podcast.
Thank you for the questions.
This was Key to My Research, a podcast produced by Changing Time in cooperation with the University of Tübingen. You can find information and the links to the sources in the show notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and recommend it to your friends and colleagues. My name is Jennifer, I'm your host. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next time.